Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Captivating Cases in Rabbinic Responsa, our 6-week journey where we listen in on the surprising practical questions your ancestors asked rabbis across Jewish history. Today's lesson, lesson 2, which is titled Torah in the Trenches, is when we are finally going to unpack one of the many steps that a rabbi needs to take when answering a question. So last week we focused on the questions. This week we're starting to focus on the answers and how rabbis would go about formulating them. And today specifically we're going to be talking about the hands-on reality of halachic decision making. In other words, gathering the facts, deducing the actual reality on the ground, and figuring out how they start to process that in terms of their response. Today's lesson is generously sponsored by Dr. Mark Essenston and Dr. Mickey Butnick, who will both be here this evening. They're not here on the Zoom, but we thank them very much for their support. May Hashem bless them with much happiness and success in all of their endeavors. We are going to open up today's lesson by doing a scene in 3 acts. How's that? Okay, Act 1 is the Nile's rise. Essentially what I'd like to do is I'd like to throw you back into my time machine, or to welcome you back into my time machine. I'll go with you. And we're going to go to 3 different periods in history. And we're going to see some very interesting stuff unfolding, kind of similar to what we saw last week with Henry VIII. Just these rabbis that are doing some very interesting research, almost looks like they're pursuing career changes. And this is how we're going to open today's lesson. Okay, the first scene takes us to Egypt, where for thousands of years, Egyptians witnessed what they called the Nile's swell, the annual swell of the Nile River. We're familiar with this even from biblical times, by the way. This was a day at some point in June. Later on in history, it gets a date, like I think June 17th becomes like a holiday in Egypt, marking this date. But even in biblical times, does anybody remember the story with Joseph, where his master's wife attempts to seduce him? Potiphar. Does anybody remember what day that was and why she had that opportunity to do so? The Torah just tells us it was a day of celebration. That's what it says. And therefore everybody left the house, and she feigned sickness and she stayed home, and then the rest of the story comes into play. In the Midrash, we get some additional details. The Midrash tells us that it was Yom Nibul Hanilus, which means it was the day of the Nile's swell. So even back then, they were celebrating the swell of the Nile River. This rise, by the way, which occurred at some point in June, and like I said, eventually gets holidays based on it, and was celebrated with festivals and celebrations in the street, etc. As you can imagine, it was because, Egypt is in a dry and arid landscape. Simply the geography of the Middle East, exactly where it is, and the Nile River swelling was considered like a massive blessing, a massive boon to the economy and to the agriculture and everything that there was locally there. The rise continued, by the way, every single year until the Aswan Dam was built in the 1970s. And obviously, since then, any area on one side of the Aswan Dam, I can't remember if it's north or south, still experiences this swell, and obviously past the dam they don't. But the real question that we want to talk about is why? Why did the Nile rise each year? So obviously in biblical times we know they ascribed this. They treated the Nile as a deity. They actually served the Nile River. We're told all about this during the story of the Exodus. But even as you go a little bit later in history, ancient philosophers had all different sorts of theories to solve this mystery. There's actually quite a bit of them, and I don't want to get into any detailed ones. Some of them attributed to astrology, and other ones attributed to snow melting in different areas and different regions. There was all sorts of. Some of it even believed it was natural. There was something under the earth that kind of came up. In any event, in the 1500s, there's a prominent rabbi who lives in Cairo, known as the Radvaz. Okay, the Radvaz is Rabbi David ibn Zimra. You can read about him on the side of text 1, because he's the author of text 1. And it turns out that in the 1500s, all of a sudden, he decides to become apparently they're called hydrologists, and he starts to look into what exactly would make the Nile swell. Tova Jane, you want to read it for us, please? This is text 1, the Nile's rise.
Okay, hold on. What page are we, Rabbi?
We are on page 51.
Hold on. 51.
Text 1, the Nile's rise. You see that?
Just trying to find it. Okay. Is the Nile's annual swelling due to rainwater or underground springs? We have been inquiring about this in a casual way of honest non-Jewish traders who come from Ethiopia. They don't know we require this information for testimony, so it's unlikely that they're lying to us. They report that in southern Ethiopia, there are torrential rains for 3 or 4 months so heavy that no one leaves their homes due to the downpours. These rains create large streams and lakes which flow and empty into the Nile, causing it to rise and swell. I also inquired of non-Jewish scholars, and they all agreed that the Nile's rise is due to the abundant rainfall. I further examined their books, and it is written in them that the cause is rain and melting snow. It is also written in their books that some of the early kings sent expeditions to explore the river and to determine its source. The explorers reported that the river originates from a mountain called Jabal al-Qamar, whatever, okay, which means mountain of the moon, and that its swelling is due to heavy rain.
Okay. So the Radvaz is turning to non-Jewish merchants, scholars, and even writings to determine the cause, what exactly the cause of the Nile's annual flooding is, and he determines that it is rainfall. Now, before we get into why he's doing this, which is really what I want to talk about, I just want to pause for a second to just clarify one phrase that we saw here. In English, they translated as, we've been inquiring about this in a casual way. In Hebrew, this is called Mesichim Lefitumam, which is actually a halachic concept, which is that because Jews were always concerned that if you ask a question of a non-Jew, particularly if it's a non-Jew who maybe doesn't value Judaism, is that putting it mildly? Okay, right. They might actually, whatever they answer you, if they know what they're talking about, and they know what the implications of their answer are, they often might subvert their answer or just try to corrupt it in order to sway whatever it is that they want to happen based on Jewish law. Like, for example, today this concept is used very often in the kosher industry, right? We will not rely on what a factory owner will tell us he does in his factory, and thereby say that it's kosher, whatever particular product he's producing is kosher. Why? Because he has a vested interest in trying to get his product kosher certified, and we're not looking for his opinion, right? Therefore, either we'll send investigators, or sometimes we'll rely on something called mesichim lefitumam, when they talk in a casual manner and they're not aware of what they're saying, but you got the information that you needed. So in this case, that's what he's saying here. He's saying, I got this information as a by the by, not that they were telling me the information in response to a question that I asked them, but rather they were telling me, the honest truth, he said this in casual conversation, if you will. All right, so that's that term. But back to the heart of the matter. Does anybody want to take a stab at why the Radvaz, this great rabbi from the 1500s, is suddenly becoming interested in the field of hydrology?
Well, the only thing I can think of is that there was at least in ancient times, there was a belief that it was caused by their gods, some connection.
Right. So in other words, yeah, but okay. And in other words, that you're saying it might have been relevant to figure out whether this is avodah zarah or not.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said, Rabbi.
So I'm trying to understand what you're saying. So you're saying this might have a relevance to the laws of avodah zarah?
Oh, avodah zarah. Well, just a refutation of other religions.
Okay. All right. We're going to soon see. For now, let's move on to scene number 2, which is called The Heartless Hen. We're going to fast forward now, get back in the time machine, 1763. Another intriguing episode. This one is Rabbi Yonasan Eibschitz, and he's consulting professors at the University of Halle, which is not far from his residence in the German city of Altona. He also has a very, very curious question. Elise, can you read it for us, please? It's on page 53, text 2, The Heartless Hen.
All right. Okay. I wrote through the veteran and exceptional scholar, Rabbi Heinrich of Halle, to submit on my behalf a question referred to as a responsum to the professors in Halle. Here is the exact test of their response. It teaches us how much caution is required when issuing Hasidic rulings. Having received 2 inquiries, the reason for which we do not know, we were asked as the physicians of this institution to investigate and provide answers based on the principles of medical science and anatomy. We convened for a session, and after careful analysis and deliberation, we reached the following response, which we present below. The first question is, if any living creature can survive for some time after its heart has been removed, whether to disease or any other cause. Regarding the second question, if a bird such as a chicken or goose is opened and no heart is found, wow, we can assume that another organ has developed in place of the heart, performing its function and therefore sustaining the bird's life in the absence of its heart.
What a peculiar question.
Yep.
and the university professors are doing their best to answer it.
Rabbi, I thought of another thing to number one.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I want to get A, okay?
All right.
He wanted to know if it was Mayim Chaim.
And the relevance for that is?
Because in order to do have a mikveh.
Very good. Okay.
In order to do mikveh, you have to have Mayim Chaim.
We're soon going to see that you're bringing up some very good points with both your answers. Okay.
Like A? Okay.
Hold on. You have an A. You have an A plus from me, Tovah.
A+.
Okay. Again, we see another example of rabbis who are typically answering questions, but instead of answering questions, they're asking questions. What intriguing questions. He asks two questions. He wants to know if it's possible for a living being to survive without a heart. And then he wants to know, in the case that you say no, is it possible for another organ to take over the function of the heart? Like maybe, I don't know, your liver, pitch in a little bit. You got to think that the heart has got to get tired sometimes. No, maybe the heart takes a break every once in a while, goes on vacation to the Maldives, and then this puts the liver or the spine in its place to take over. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what he's asking here, but it's first of all, it's pseudoscience at best, clearly. But he's asking this peculiar question. Why? Does anybody want to take a stab at why you think a rabbi is interested in the anatomy of a chicken?
How it relates to kashrut?
I think that's probably a very good guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
How it relates to the laws of kosher. I mean, we're going to have to see exactly how that's going to work. But yeah, that's a very good question.
How often did that happen? That they cut up
exactly. I mean, it's just a strange question. Let's move on to number 3, shall we? Scene number 3, because we're just setting the scenes here, so that's why I'm moving at a quick pace. We're going to do each of these in depth properly. The third one is called the Cypriot chicken. Marilyn, I see you just joined us. If you'd like to read for us, it's going to be text 3 on page 55. I don't know if you have your book with you.
I don't have my book with me.
Okay, that's okay. So we'll go back to Tovah Jane. But we first have to get back into the time machine. And this time we're going to go to Rabbi Naftali Chaim of Horowitz, whose adventures in the 1860s don't just have him sitting and writing letters to universities, but he actually embarks on a what I'm going to call a wild chicken case, like a wild chicken chase. There we go. Let's see his own account in his own words. Tovah Jane, if you can read it for us, please. Text 3. Again, this is the mid-1800s.
Okay. Regarding the Cypriot chicken, I wish to inform you that I purchased a specimen in the holy city of Jerusalem and another in Izmir, in Smyrna. I don't know where that is exactly.
Okay.
I was unable to purchase one in Cyprus itself because there are no Jews on the Greek islands, and the locals do not understand our language. However, I saw that the captain brought these chickens onto the ship that sailed from Cyprus as provisions for the passengers. They were entirely identical to the chickens I later bought in Izmir, without the slightest difference in sound, appearance, or height. I offered the ship's captain 10 coins for one chicken, but he refused. The people from the Holy Land who were traveling with me on the ship advised me to buy one in Izmir, which is a day's journey from Cyprus. It is widely known that merchants transport many thousands of these chickens from Cyprus to Izmir, so I purchased a chicken in Izmir. I'm sorry, I can't. It sounds...
It's quite ludicrous.
Like
you have this rabbi walking around literally
it sounds like a Borscht Belt thing. All right.
Yeah, he's running around buying chickens. Go ahead.
These chickens are in the possession of my teacher and grandfather-in-law, Rabbi Chaim of Sans in Galicia.
Anyways, check this out in the map on page 57. He's literally on a pursuit of Cypriot chicken. And the question is why? Again, the question is why? All right. Before we dive into these particular instances, I want to introduce the first tool in a rabbi's toolbox when it comes to answering these questions. throughout the generations, we've discussed that it's happened over 650,000 times. It's been documented over 650,000 times. It's happened millions of times. People would turn to rabbis with questions. Those questions would range on every single topic in Judaism, all with the same question, essentially, as the punchline. What is the Torah law? What does the Torah desire that we do in this particular instance? Rabbis had a multi-step process that they would follow when they would attempt to answer these questions. And the first thing that they would need to do is they would need to gather the facts. But you could imagine that before even gathering the facts, a rabbi approaching a question that there is no answer to in the Torah, clearly, because if there was a very clear passage in the Talmud that said exactly what we should do, or even better, in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Jewish Code of Law, that told us exactly what we should do, obviously the rabbi's question becomes easy. I get asked questions like that all the time. Rabbi, am I allowed to do this on Shabbos? And it's a clear question. It's lifted directly out of the Shulchan Aruch. I don't need to consult with anyone. I don't need to write long essays. I just answer the question, right? But what about when a rabbi is asked a more difficult question? Right? So for me, it's easy. I just forward it to higher authorities. I ask it by more advanced hours, etc. But ultimately, somebody's going to have to actually take that brazen step and answer that question. And you could imagine the trepidation with which rabbis over the centuries have approached these questions, because to them this has been a very, very they're God-fearing. They really want to do the right thing. They don't want to advise someone what to do when the Torah doesn't. When they don't believe that that's actually based on exactly what the Torah wants to do. They don't want to just answer based on what they feel is right. And in case anybody does feel they should be answering that way, you're experienced, you're wise, you have Torah knowledge, so now just give your own intuition. I just want to remind you what some of these questions look like. Last week, we had a question from the father in Auschwitz, and the way he's asking whether he's allowed to or not allowed to ransom his or whatever, bribe his son out of literally out of death's jaws. And the rabbi doesn't want to answer, right? So if a rabbi is truly God-fearing, it doesn't need to be a life or death situation. Every situation should be, to a certain degree, life or death. Either they're following the right way, which is the Torah, which is life, right? The Torah tells us, see, I have put, what does Moshe Rabbeinu tell us in Devarim? See, I have put before you
life and death.
The way of life, which is good. So if somebody comes over to you with chicken and asks you if it's kosher or not, or if somebody comes over to you with anything and says, is this the way the Torah wants you to do it or not, you got to be really
give me some lentils and cheese
in order to properly be able to answer that question. Right?
Drink your
I'm just going to mute you. Sorry. Hold on. There we go. Okay. You got to be really gutsy to be able to answer that question. And where does a rabbi take that certainty from? So text 4a is a very interesting text because it gives us some insight into here. Let me just give you the background here, and Elise, if you can read it for us, please. Text 4a and 4b, but I'll give you the background first. So this is essentially the first time that King David comes on the scene in the book of Samuel. In the book of Samuel, King Saul is looking for an attendant. Well, he's looking for an assistant. The reason he's looking for an assistant is as follows. He's looking for a musician to play for him, to lift his spirits. A spirit of melancholy is the way the Torah puts it, the Tanakh puts it, had fallen over King Saul. And there's this musician that gets referred to him. And ultimately that musician is going to be David, the son of Jesse, or Yishai, David ben Yishai. And eventually he ends up marrying one of King Saul's daughters. And then eventually King Saul, they have a very storied history, as we know, right? But for now, Elise, if you could read to us how King David is presented. What is what are his accolades?
Okay. One of the attendants spoke up. I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who is skilled in music, a mighty warrior, a man of battle, intelligent, handsome, and God is with him.
What does it mean that God was with him? Right? It sounds very poetic and it sounds very beautiful. What does it mean that God was with him? So the Talmud actually dissects this and it explains. What does it mean that God was with him? Keep going, at least. Text 4b.
God is with him, meaning the halacha follows his ruling in every case.
So you have this minister or this attendant or this advisor talking to King Saul, and he's talking up this young boy David. And what does he say? He says, Vashem imo, God is with him. Right? And the Talmud explains what does it mean that God is with him, that he noticed an interesting phenomenon about David. Whenever David was asked a question, right? And maybe the question was asked of multiple people, for halachic ruling, David's answer ultimately always was the one that proved to be the most accurate and compelling, and eventually the halacha was like him. For some reason, that's the way it was. He would give his answer, and it would be one answer of among many, and then eventually it would become clear that King David's answer was the correct answer. This is what he means, God is with him, indicating that Hashem's help must have been involved, that there must have been some godly inspiration, intervention, guidance, whatever you want to call it, that God was there at King David's right hand as he was saying his answer. This concept in Judaism is what is known as siyata dishmaya. That's two Aramaic words, which means heaven's help. You may recognize these words, siyata dishmaya. We say it actually every Shabbat in the Yikum Purkam Min Shemaya. So we say later, siyata dishmaya, which means the help of heaven. In fact, many people have the custom, anytime they write on a paper, any of the flyers that you see that come out from Chabad will often have either the letters BH or BSD, or in Hebrew, Bet Hey or Bet Samach Daled on the top of them. What does that mean? So Bet Hey we know stands for Baruch Hashem or Bezrat Hashem, which means blessed be God or with the help of God. In other words, this is an endeavor that we hope that God is assisting with. What does Bet Samach Daled stand for? It stands for B'siyata Dishmaya, which means with the help of heaven. And this concept, which comes from this verse about King David, has long been a Jewish belief or a Jewish understanding about what happens when we ask a rabbi. There's a story that is told, a classic story that's told by Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, who was the legendary rabbi of Prague in the 18th century. And early in his tenure, he faced a lot of opposition. I keep pressing the wrong button. There we go. He faced a lot of opposition. Whereby there were certain people, surprise, surprise, right? There was a new rabbi that came to town, and some people liked him, and some people didn't like him. All right, now you see that it didn't start today; it started a long time ago. So Rabbi Yecheskel, so eventually he gains the entire community support, and he's a legendary rabbi for many reasons. But in the beginning, he faced a lot of opposition. And some of his opponents, in one instance, wanted to embarrass him publicly. What did they do? It was during a bris milah, during a circumcision, which was hosted by one of the most prominent Jewish families in Prague. And so the group brought the femur of a cow, right? So a thigh of some sort, whatever it was. They brought it to the rabbi to see whether it's kosher or not. And they didn't give him all the details. And he inspected it, and he started to give his explanation for why he felt it was kosher. Okay? They waited until he said that it was kosher, and once he said it was kosher, they came out with the other details of the story. They said, see, the rabbi doesn't know what he's talking about, it's incorrect, it's not kosher, and they said whatever other details there were. When Rabbi Landau realized that games were being played here, he turned, stopped, and addressed the entire crowd, and he said, Jews, the Rebbe would share this story on many occasions, specifically because of this point, this line that he says. He says, Jews appoint rabbis to rule on the halachic questions that arise. But what about the possibility that a rabbi might err? A rabbi may make a mistake. Rabbis are not perfect. They're not God. They are human beings. The answer is that God does not desire that a Jewish community should follow an erroneous decision. So what does he do? Hashem provides siyata dishmaya. He provides help, assistance from heaven to guide the rabbi to make sure that his ruling would be correct. And here's his kicker. He says, but when is that siyata dishmaya present? Only when there's a legitimate question being asked, right? Hashem doesn't come down and assist a rabbi for games that the community is playing. That's a different story. So therefore he says, I must have ruled wrongly. Why? Because there was no siyata dishmaya assisting me in this situation. This knowledge, I think, this belief that rabbis, when we ask a rabbi, we're not just asking a rabbi, we're asking a rabbi to rule to the best of his ability as a human being, according to the Torah, and having studied Torah, we're asking to rule according to the best of his ability, and then we are believing that it's not just him answering, but rather he is guided by the hand of God. This explains a lot about what we were talking about in Lesson 1. In Lesson 1, we observed this weird phenomenon, this insistence that Jews had, that our ancestors had throughout the generations in the craziest of circumstances to ask the craziest of questions to rabbis, as if the rabbis somehow have the right answer. Case in point, the story of Rabbi Meisels in the Holocaust, right? What exactly does this father expect of him? And if you remember the text that we read then, I'm not going to go back and reference it now, but you can look it up on your own. What did the father say to Rabbi Meisels? He says to him, I have done my part. I have asked the question of a rabbi. As if somehow that absolves him of everything, and now it's the rabbi's fault. Right? Like now his son's life is the rabbi's fault that his son is being killed. What does that mean? What it means is he's saying the Torah has given us a system. We read about the origin of that system last week, and now we're learning an additional detail about that system, that system involves siyata d'shmaya. We don't just ask rabbis questions because we believe that they are some sort of saint. No, they are human beings just like us, but when they answer the question, they are answering with siyata d'shmaya. Why? Because of the very fact that we came and asked it. When I come and I ask a question of a rabbi, and the rabbi answers to the best of his ability based on Torah knowledge, he is given that special divine assistance, if you will. That's what we're talking about here. Now, obviously, there's a few things that have to be met in order for this to happen. Number one is, as we mentioned, it has to be a genuine question. It can't just be games, right? A real question that a Jew is asking the rabbi. And the second point is, obviously, the rabbi has to be a God-fearing individual. We're not talking here about random people that just pretend to be rabbis and walk around. No, right? And all they want is prestige or whatever. No. If the rabbi is a real God-fearing individual, right? If the rabbi really means it truthfully, meitas mitanemes, like we say in Yiddish, he really means to try and do and be sincere and answer this question properly, so then he is given this divine assistance. Okay. Once we've established this ground, this foundation, this groundwork before we start, so now we can start to dive into the first step that a rabbi would do trying to answer that question. And that is a significant part of the rabbi's efforts involved studying ancient texts, obviously, and applying them to our situation. Maybe he studies the Talmud, studies the Torah, and tries to apply it. But in addition to that, he cannot be a monk. He cannot live in some sort of la-la land of just studying Torah all day, and that's it, and not be aware of the reality of the world. He has to be able to travel beyond the books and see the reality on the ground. And this starts, by the way, all the way from Talmudic times. Take a look, Tova Jane, of a Talmudic example, text 5, page 61. This is a Talmudic example of all the later examples that we've already read about. A strange phenomenon. What does Rav say? Rav was one of the greatest Amoraim, sages in the Talmud. I'm so glad Tova Jane is reading it. She's in the middle of doing Daf Yomis. She's a Talmudic scholar herself. Go ahead. Text 5.
I know the answer to the question. Okay, anyhow. Rav said, I apprenticed with a shepherd for 18 months to learn which blemish is permanent and which is temporary.
Why is Rav all of a sudden spending 18 months of his time? He was already a rabbi. And even if he wasn't a rabbi, he was a rabbinical student. He's steeped in the world of Torah and Tanakh and Talmud and discussing yes or no questions with regards to Torah law. All of a sudden, he's going to spend time with shepherds. The answer is he's trying to figure out laws. He's trying to figure out what is the reality on the ground that would then affect the laws. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's what we mean when we say beyond the books. In this case, he's trying to figure out, I don't want to get into all the nuanced details of it, but he's trying to figure out with regards to a Jew who owns a firstborn male cow, goat, or sheep. We actually read about this in last week's parsha, by the way. I think it was in the last Aliyah. In other words, the seventh reading of last week's Torah portion, we read about the fact that just like a Jew has to redeem his firstborn son, right? Some of you may have heard of this before. So similarly, the firstborn of your animals, cows, goat, or sheep, need to be given to a Kohen. Now, the problem is that because the temple is no longer standing, you can't give it to the Kohen. It cannot become a korban or a sacrifice in the temple, so therefore you need to wait for a blemish. And he had to figure out what is the difference between a mum kavua or a mum over, which means a permanent blemish or a temporary blemish. Again, I'm not going to bore you with too much of the details, but he had to go hang out with the shepherds in order to find out these details. That's what we're talking about here. So this is, when we say that a rabbi cannot just be knowledgeable in the books, but he has to go beyond the books, this is what we're talking about. And I'll give you a little bit more of a modern example. In 1948, there was a rabbi who was offered a position. His name was Rabbi Shalom Ber Gordon. I'm sharing this story because I heard it directly from him via recording, and I got this recording from his grandson, who is my brother-in-law. So my brother-in-law is a grandson of this rabbi, and I remember him telling me the story. I asked him to share with, just this morning, I asked him, can you share with me the details of that story? I had heard it from him before, and he says, you know what, I can do you one better. I have a recording of my grandfather saying the story himself, so let me share it with you. So he sends me this recording. It's a 7-minute recording. I'm not going to play it in the class. It's very fuzzy, etc. It's from, 1948, he is offered a position to be a rabbi in a community in Newark. Massive shul, 12 to 1,500 seats, beautiful, etc. Okay. Now he's a religious Jew, he's a Chabadnik, and he's planning to take the position. He has 2 issues, okay? One of the issues I won't get into, even though it really plays a relevant detail in the story later on, but I think it'll distract us. But one of the issues was that the shul operated with a microphone. There was a rabbi there who considered himself Orthodox, and he felt that using a microphone on Shabbat and holidays was allowed. Okay? He took the position in the shul on condition that there's not a microphone will not be used on Shabbat or holidays. Okay, he starts his tenure, and a couple years later, it's now the early 19 teens, I guess, or tens, whatever it is. At some point after 1951, and sorry, it's the early 1950s. My bad, I was thinking in the Hebrew years. It's the early 1950s, and the community is still not happy. Why are they not happy? Because he's giving these beautiful sermons, and he's doing his best to scream at the top of his lungs every time he does so, but not everybody in the shul can hear him. And they come over to him and they say, listen, would you reconsider the microphone? He says, no, under no circumstances. I am Orthodox. You cannot use a microphone on Shabbos. And so they say to him, listen, we had a feeling you would say that. We have a different question. Can we ask the new Rebbe this question? Remember, where are we here? We're in the early 1950s. So in 1948, when he had become the rabbi of the shul, his Rebbe was the previous Chabad Rebbe, the Rayatz. But in 1950, the Rebbe Rayatz passed away. Actually, his yahrzeit is not tomorrow, but the next day. So Wednesday this week will be the yahrzeit of the Rebbe Rayatz, the previous Chabad Rebbe. 1 year later, 1951, our Rebbe had taken over the leadership. Again, we're going to be commemorating that this Wednesday. And for those of you that are not signed up yet, this is a perfect opportunity for me to plug the upcoming Shabbaton that we're having in honor of this, exploring the Rebbe's thought, talking all about the way, the perspective of the Rebbe and the way the Rebbe saw the world. We're going to be doing all that over Shabbos with a guest speaker, Rabbi Dr. Yosef Bronstein, who authored a book called Engaging the Essence, all about the Rebbe's thought. So if you'd like to join us for that, you can join us for that. So this story takes place in between the two, you understand? So it starts during the life. Now what happened? These folks that were in the shul had heard that the Rebbe is a little more modern. You know, he wears a different hat, he wears a fedora, he's younger, he's only in his 50s, he's not in his 90s. He went to college, he has an electrical engineering background. Okay, we want to ask him the question. Rabbi Gordon said, with pleasure. I'd be more than honored to bring you to see my Rebbe. If my Rebbe says it's okay, I will do it, no problem. Beautiful. So they come to see the Rebbe, and they ask the Rebbe this question. Ultimately, the Rebbe gives them an answer that it's not allowed. But between the lines, what happened was the Rebbe shared with them the following. The Rebbe said there are 4 categories of people in this world. A little bit sharp, but the Rebbe said it with a smile, and the Rebbe said it very beautifully to them, in a very nice way. The Rebbe said to them, in order to address a question about using a microphone on Shabbos, there are some people who try to answer the question, and they have in-depth knowledge of electrical engineering, but they have no idea about the laws of Shabbos. They've never looked into it. There are some people that they don't know the first thing about electrical engineering, but they're rabbis, and they're well-versed in the laws of Shabbos, and they try to answer the question. The Rebbe turned to them and said, there are some people that don't know the laws of electrical engineering, and they don't know the laws of Shabbos, and they attempt to answer, and they attempt to say that you're allowed to use a microphone on Shabbos, tongue-in-cheek, or whatever, I don't know, in a subtle way. The Rebbe was telling them, you don't know anything about it. Then the Rebbe said, I happen to be an electrical engineer. The Rebbe had a degree in electrical engineering. He actually spent some time helping out the war effort, working in the Brooklyn Navy Yards. Anyway, not for now. And the Rebbe said, and I happen to have learned through. And as you remember, the Rebbe didn't want to say that he was well versed and you know could have said anything from the entire Talmud, whether the Babylonian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud. He knew it all by heart. He knew all the different rulings about it, etc. But the Rebbe just said, I have been through the laws of Shabbos, and I'm telling you that it's not allowed. In other words, the Rebbe was referencing this concept that often what we need to have is not just a scholarly or a Torah scholarly knowledge, but we actually also need to have a scientific knowledge of some sort, or a knowledge of the world in some sort. And on this, we have a beautiful video, which I'd like to play for you, which really spells this out and gives even a few examples. So please turn your attention to the video screens as we continue our lesson.
Are religion and science reluctant to inhabit the same planet? Many Jews imagine the Torah peering down from the detached heights of Sinai with an almighty frown.
Oop, what did I do? Hold on.
Feel how Sinai with an almighty frown as frantic scientists in white coats scurry across God's earth with thermometers and anemometers, and other tools of utter apostasy. The real deal, however, is that the Torah has always supported scientific inquiry and findings. Through the 3.5 millennia since Moses, and today more than ever, the Torah expects rabbis to keep a microscope and stethoscope within easy reach, or to at least have someone reliable with the latest scientific knowledge to consult in order to make valid Torah decisions. Rabbi Beryl Bell is a Dayan, or Torah justice, at the Rabbinical Court of Montreal. He is also a Yale University graduate. Here, Rabbi Bell discusses some of the myriad instances in which scientific knowledge is considered critical to determining Jewish law.
There's a famous institute for the study of Jewish law and contemporary technology in Israel, which is one of the most advanced in the world. Among the many important works that they have written is a whole book regarding an elevator that is constructed specifically for use on the Sabbath. And in their investigation of the situation, they found that some elevators that were thought to be okay to be used on the Sabbath were actually constructed in such a way exactly the opposite of the way they were supposed to be constructed. So one might think that you have an elevator and more people going in the elevator, in order to get that elevator up, the additional people going in the elevator causes more energy to be expended. However, when the elevator is coming down, so then the people are adding more weight and one would need to use less energy. So one might think that going down in an elevator is not so much of a problem. There might be other problems involved in pressing the buttons on the floor, but in terms of the additional energy being expended on the way down, it would not be important. But on going up, additional energy would need to be expended. However, in actuality, that's not the way the elevators were constructed. The elevators were constructed with a counterweight, and that's why there's a maximum capacity for an elevator. In order to lift up the actual car, where the room where the people are sitting, one lets go of the brake on the counterweight, and as the counterweight goes down, the elevator goes up. The problem is, in order to get the elevator down, you have to expend energy to lift up the counterweight. So it's the other way around, and that's what needs to be regulated. Therefore, whether it's elevators that are meant to be used on the Sabbath or other sorts of appliances or various devices that are designed for use of the Sabbath, they have to have proper rabbinic supervision, such as from Rabbi Halperin's Institute, that have electricians and engineers and various scientists on board to ensure that not only Jewish law is being interpreted properly, but the actual facts on the ground are properly understood in order that the decision of Jewish law is in accordance with the actual facts on the ground.
Today, Torah and science march happily hand in hand in a wide variety of issues. Some are rather rudimentary, such as the seemingly innocuous question of how to boil water.
It was a case where the supervisor who was responsible for overseeing the kosherization of the equipment, who knew that the water has to get up to the temperature of boiling, which is 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius, and was having problems. No matter what they did to the equipment, it couldn't get up to the proper temperature. And when he called back to the office, we told him, well, what altitude are you at? And we found out the exact location. We're able to check out the altitude, and it turns out it was high enough that it was physically impossible for the water to get to the proper temperature that would be possible to attain at sea level, because the water would boil out at a lower temperature. So although it's elementary scientific knowledge that the boiling point changes in altitude, nevertheless it was knowledge of this that enabled us to declare this product kosher.
Other cases, however, involve the very latest that technology has to offer.
Eggs today, where they're raising the eggs to turn into chicks, which are eventually going to turn into chickens, are vaccinated in a method that's called in ovo, meaning when the chick is still within the egg, there's a very, very thin needle which is used to penetrate the egg and put the vaccine into the sac of the egg, the liquid of the egg. And one must be careful not to go so far as to penetrate the internal organs of the chick, which could render it not kosher. And this is something which requires knowledge of exactly how it is and at what stage of development and in which manner this is being done in order to ensure that its kosher status is being preserved.
More than at any previous era in history, rabbinical experts communicate and collaborate with experts in the broadest spectrum of scientific fields, from space travel to oven designs, from medical breakthroughs to the newest construction techniques. As modern science expands rapidly in all directions, it produces countless innovations in the application of timeless Jewish law.
What I think is so beautiful about the way this is explained is that often people look at science as a contradiction to Torah. Either you believe in science or you believe in Torah. You can't believe in both. And I say the exact opposite. I say science almost demands that science is not offering solutions to every single issue on the planet. It's not offering answers to the meaning of life or to how the universe came into existence. They're just observing phenomena. And the Torah is not trying to help you observe all the phenomena on the earth. Both of them are required in order to be a proper Jew. You need to be observing what's going on in the world and then following what the Torah says to do in a situation like that, based on believing that the world was created by a divine entity, and that that divine entity has given us instructions as to what we should be doing in this world. So the two marry very well together. And now I think we can begin to understand what was going on in every single one of those strange scenes that we set at the beginning of today's lesson. But before we do that, let me give you one fourth one. All right? The fourth one is going to involve an Israeli ocean liner. Okay? So it is the 1950s. Hold on, there's the video, but there we go. It's the 1950s, and people are traveling to Israel. Many people, as you can imagine, right? This is the beginning of the modern state of Israel. And they're doing so by ocean liner. And there was a national Jewish carrier called Zim. You can still see them today. They're no longer a passenger liner, but they still are a cargo liner. And every once in a while, usually if I'm stuck in traffic, I'll even snap a picture of it. I'll be driving down the freeway, and you see some truck driving along with a container, and on the container it says Zim. From the Israeli shipping company. But back then, it was also a passenger liner. What was the issue? The issue was that traveling from America to Israel, or vice versa, took more than a week and inevitably included Shabbos. When traveling on a ship that is operated by non-Jews, there could be issues, but halacha permits staying on board during Shabbos. Think of like if you've ever been on a cruise, as long as you're not boarding or disembarking on a Shabbos, for the most part, you're in the clear. Obviously, you still need to be eating kosher, and on Shabbos there are certain issues that you would still need to look into on the ship. So you can still consult your local Orthodox rabbi. But if it's being conducted by non-Jews, then it's not an issue. But if a ship is being conducted by Jews, then you have an issue of Jews that are working on Shabbos for you, and therefore it would be prohibited for a Jew to even travel on that ship. So some suggested that the Israeli ships should dock in places like Bermuda or places like that for the duration of Shabbos. But others were less inclined to adopt that solution. And they pointed to rabbis who permitted the ships to continue sailing on Shabbos, provided that there was no forbidden work that would be performed by any of the crew on that day, on Shabbos. And Zim argued that this would become their protocol. Their protocol would be that on Shabbos it would only be operated by non-Jews, or nothing needed to be done. It could all be done automatically on Shabbos or something like that. Now the Lubavitcher Rebbe typically did not offer rabbinic responsa. Usually he would refer people to rabbis to get their answers, rabbis that were specific in that field. But with regards to this question, uncharacteristically, the Rebbe did weigh in. Elise, if you can read for us, please, text 6 on page 62. This was the question that was addressed to the Rebbe. Can Zim ships travel over Shabbos? Let's see what the Rebbe says.
Okay, Shabbat at sea. The mitzvah of Shabbat observance that you write about is one of the most fundamental ones. And as the rabbis state in the Talmud, Yerushalmi Nadarim 3.9, that the Sabbath equals in importance all the other mitzvot combined. I mentioned this particularly in reference to your inquiry regarding the Sabbath desecration, which is perpetrated by the Jewish ocean liners. The claim that everything is done automatically during the 24 hours of Sabbath is absurd, and I state it with the fullest authority, being an engineer myself and having studied marine mechanics. For one thing, certain machinery cannot be operated automatically, especially those connected with the steering, radio communication services, and similar ones. Secondly, even those machines which can operate automatically are required by their very operation, as well as by international law, to be checked periodically every few hours, which involves direct Sabbath desecration a corresponding number of times during the 24-hour period of the Sabbath. Thirdly, certain so-called automatic machines, including some of the boilers, require a change of parts periodically, approximately every 6 hours, when the effective sections of these machines are stopped and restarted for the said purpose. The water which is supplied for drinking and even running water in the cabins is derived from the seawater by a process of distillation, which, as you no doubt know, means the boiling and the evaporation of the water, and converted it back to distilled water by cooling. The water supply is not stored for days ahead, not even for 24 hours, because of the storage space it would require, but is produced continually by a process of distillation. Only one who has no concept of how such machines are operated can be made to believe the absurd claim that an ocean liner can, for 24 hours, be operated automatically without any Sabbath desecration. Unfortunately, there have been rabbis who have been misled and have misled others on this subject. In their ignorance of the technical aspects involved and under the influence of misleading statements by technicians who, for reasons of their own, did not choose to disclose all the facts, these rabbis have regretfully been misled into thinking or even declaring openly that no Sabbath desecration was here involved.
So the Rebbe is drawing on his background in engineering and in marine mechanics, which was literally the Rebbe's expertise. That's what he went to college for. That's what he graduated in, and to clarify the realities at sea. And the Rebbe is saying anybody who would argue differently clearly doesn't have a knowledge. The Rebbe is not saying they don't have a knowledge of the way Shabbos works. The Rebbe is saying they don't have a knowledge of the way ocean liners work. And this is a textbook example of needing to establish the facts, needing to know how the facts on the ground look, and to do your due diligence before clarifying a question. And now we can go back to our three other scenarios. Let's do number one. Let's go back. So I hope nobody's getting seasick or time sick from all this time travel. But let's go back to the 1500s Cairo, to the Radvaz, and see how he argued in the case of or whatever. First, let's see what the case was, and then let's see what he argued, why he was doing his due diligence with regards to the Nile River and exactly what made the Nile River swell on the same day or around the same day every single year. It turns out that in all three of these instances, the case of the Nile rise, the case of the heartless hen, and the case of the Cypriot chicken, all of them are going to be the same case. It is a case of a rabbi doing his due diligence to figure out what's going on the ground so that he can then go and rule based on his Torah knowledge. All right? So let's start with the case of the Nile rising. Medieval Cairo, you can follow with me if you'd like in the map on page 64. Medieval Cairo sat just east of the mighty Nile River. The ancients, going back all the way to biblical times, by the way, had constructed what was called Khalij. There were multiple of these. You can see the Khalij al-Nasiri, the Khalij al-Misri, etc. These were canals that were designed to channel the Nile's annual swelling and to take advantage of it, to bring them directly into the city. And for a few months each year, it remained nothing but a dry crater. I don't know, maybe the kids like to bike along it, that kind of thing. Provided a bike lane for all those that needed it. But during the rest of the year, which was the summer and however long the swell lasted for, it would fill with water and become a vital source of fresh water for the city's inhabitants. Now, as you can see, the Jews of Cairo lived just alongside one of these kalishes, one of these canals. You can see the Jewish quarter where the Maimonides synagogue was. And therefore, this presented a very tempting opportunity for Jews, yes, Tova Jane, to use it for the mikveh. Jewish women, married Jewish women, need to go to the mikveh based on their menstrual cycle. And Jews, of course, were going to the mikveh, I assume in the Nile River. Actually, no, we have historical evidence the fact that there were mikvahs that were actually built in shuls. And in order to build those mikvahs in those shuls, it was very, very difficult. They had to actually dig very, very deep down until the natural water of the earth would come up. It was much deeper than anybody else had to dig. And those were also kosher mikvahs, okay? And this is actually a great opportunity for me to introduce you to two different terms in Hebrew, which you can see on page 65 in the figure. In Hebrew, there's something called a mayan, and then there's something called a mikvah. And these are both kosher for a woman to immerse in ritually in order to be biblically pure and to be allowed to be with her husband. A mayan, which is the easier one, is a spring. It's on the land surface. It's fed by an underground aquifer, and by definition, it is considered mayim chayim, living water, which would be kosher for someone to immerse in. A mikveh is a little more complicated. Mikveh means a gathering, okay? Mikveh mayim means a gathering of water. And essentially what it refers to is rainwater, but rainwater is the exact opposite of a mayan. You have to gather that rainwater into one place. It's pretty complicated, actually, because it cannot gather anywhere else before that. And once it gathers, it has to stay put. But when that water gathers, that water cannot be flowing. Okay, so the most common example of this is, so in other words, the water must be stationary. So the most common example of this is when mikveh, I'll share with you some of the architectural designs of our mikveh here in Pasadena. If you ever go into our mikveh here in Pasadena, you will notice that the design, the tile design of the wall of the pool of the mikveh is very strange. It goes with one style tile, one aesthetic of tile, up until the height of probably, if I'm standing inside the pool, the height of maybe just below my shoulder. And then the design changes for about 6 inches, and then it goes back to the other design and it keeps going up. Why is that? That's because when you build the mikveh, the rabbis will insist that you incorporate into your design, and they don't care what type of tiles you use, but you have to incorporate into your design a different style aesthetic, which will then form a permanent water line for where the water should be. And that should be a good foot below the rim, in other words, below the lip of the mikveh. So think of your pool in your backyard. The pool in your backyard usually is filled as close as possible to the top. Obviously, you don't want it overflowing, and then it rains, and it overflows a little bit, and it goes into your garden, etc. But you don't care about that. For the most part, you want your pool to be as full as possible. You don't need it low. But a mikveh actually has a strange halachic problem. What is that? This unique issue that if you go into the water, when a person puts their body into the water, obviously it makes the water level rise. If it's going to make the water level rise so much so that while the woman is immersing in the water, or even a man, while they're immersing in the water is also overflowing over the edge. And by the way, the same applies to dishes, by the way. Okay? And there's another, I'm not going to get into all of them, but there's another architectural design with regards to our dishes mikveh to avoid that. If while you are immersing something in the mikveh, the water is flowing, even if flowing just means out of the pit that it is in, that invalidates the mikveh of water. Okay? So, now the question becomes very, very clear. Does the kalish qualify for kosher immersion? What is the question? What is the origin of the Nile swell? If the origin of the Nile swell is some form of natural phenomena that is happening under the Nile, where water is gushing forth under the Nile and causing the Nile to swell, then it has the halachic categorization of a mayan. In other words, it's okay for it to be flowing water. But if it's actually just rainwater that somehow is flowing down into the Nile somewhere and we're not aware of it, but it's a tremendous amount of rainwater, which, by the way, ultimately is what he determined, that it was this Ethiopian rain that would wash down. Think of like, here in California, we get from the Sierra Nevada, we get the rushing of the melting snow coming down here, and it'll fill even I don't know if the Ellie River, but it'll fill different reservoirs down here in Southern California, right? So if we establish that it's rainwater, then it would have to not be flowing. You have to make sure it's not flowing. But if it is, and in this case, the kalish would be totally invalidated. Why? Because the kalish was flowing. They would intentionally make it flow in different ways as a channel to get to different places in the city, right? But if it would have been a mayan, then it would have been kosher. What does he eventually rule? Okay, so I kind of skipped ahead a little bit. So many assume that it was the result of rainfall in Ethiopia, but the Radbaz learns when he consults experts that there was also a mythical theory popular among the masses. Elise, if you can read it for us, please. It's text 7 on page 65. The mysterious mud ritual.
Okay, mysterious mud ritual. They weigh the river mud on a designated night called Lelet al-Nupta. And according to the increase in the mud's weight on that night, the Nile will rise that year. This indicates that the increase is from the Nile's natural underground sources and not from rainwater.
This is the ancient Egyptian version of Groundhog, not Groundhog Day, of the whatever, the groundhog with the right? Whether he goes this way or that way, it's going to be a good winter or not a good winter. It's so interesting that we're having this conversation when I think most of the United States, besides for where we live, is undergoing a terrible, terrible winter right now. I mean, like, they're freezing cold and terrible snowfall. All my relatives on the East Coast, in Maryland and upstate New York, and even in Brooklyn, they're all having these terrible, terrible snows. Anyways, so what happens? This whole debate about where the water comes from leads to a resident of Cairo approaching the Radvaz, which leads to the Radvaz doing his research, and in text 8, we finally have his conclusion. Tova Jane, if you can read it for us, please. Immersion in the Kalish, page 66.
Okay. You asked me, so I'll inform you of my opinion. It is permissible to immerse in the Kalish, a place that has no water throughout.
Not it is. He's still listing the question. Is it?
Oh, okay. But is it permissible to immerse in the Kalish, a place that has no water throughout the year, but when the Nile rises, the water enters there and flows intensely? The question is whether it has the status of mikveh, rainwater gathering, or mayim, spring. Teshuva answer. Generally, rivers swell due to the surface runoff from rain or melting snow. And as it is said that this is also the case of the Nile, its swelling is fed by the rains in Ethiopia. It is thus clear that one should not emerge in the Kalish because it is a mikveh only, in the Kalish, because a mikveh only purifies with still waters. However, one way to make this work is to place barriers in the water, rendering the place between the barriers gathered and still, which makes it kosher for immersion. I have written this, what appears correct to me in my humble opinion.
So he even gives them, so even though he disqualifies the Kalish as a kosher mikveh as it is, he gives them a solution. He says, listen, if you want to do it, you'll have to figure out a way to seal off a section where there will not be flowing water, where the water will actually be stationary. The Kalish water is fine. It's just the fact that it's flowing that's an issue. So if you could figure out a way to do that, and we don't have any historical evidence that they ever built something like this. I mean, I assume the women weren't going to be going, maybe there was like a deserted area. They weren't going to be going out in public to the mikveh, right? So they kind of were planning to build something. So maybe they did build a stationary kosher area for immersion. I don't know. But regardless, this is a classic case of a rabbi doing his due diligence in order and finding out the facts about the scientific matter on the ground in order to be able to answer this question. Yes, Steve.
All right. So this is the first time I'm looking at in detail about what is or isn't qualified to be a mikveh. So what you're saying is groundwater is not. It can't be. No,
groundwater is kosher for a mikveh. As long as it's completely fresh water from underground, that's fine.
So what is it about the flowing factor? What?
So when it's a spring, it's allowed. When it's a natural body of water, it's allowed to flow. When the water is rainwater, then it has to be stationary.
Ah.
That's it. Okay. It's a technicality. And by the way, now would be a great time to just remind everybody that going to the mikveh and the laws of purity and impurity in general are very, very much chukim. They are laws that we have no idea the reasoning for them or the explanation behind them. So it is very difficult for me to talk about why this would be allowed and that wouldn't be allowed. We have the basics for it in the Torah. The Torah tells us what's allowed and what's not allowed. Here, we're just trying to figure out what the reality is on the ground. Okay. Let's move on to case number 2. The heartless hen. Yes? All right. So just to refresh everybody's memory, earlier we observed Rabbi Yonas and Eibschitz asking bizarre questions to professors at Halle University. By now we already know what was the reason he was doing this. He's trying to determine a certain scientific reality in order that he should be able to issue a proper halachic ruling in turn. Yes? What is that scientific reality? Let's see. In those days, this is the only introduction I think we need. In those days, meaning your grandmother's days, because Rabbi Yonas and Eibschitz is not a long time ago, Jews did not go to Trader Joe's, not just because Trader Joe's wasn't around, but they also did not go to Trader Joe's and just buy a nice kosher chicken and bring it home and pop it in their oven and just have delicious, or pop it into a soup and have a nice delicious chicken soup. The way it worked was you would go to the market and you would buy a chicken, you'd bring it to the home or to the office or whatever or yard of the shochet, the local ritual slaughterer. He would shecht it for you, but you would have to do the rest on your own. It wouldn't come in a nice package. You'd have to now go about melicha, which is salting the animal to make sure that there's no blood. So Jewish women were knowledgeable in this in order to just be able to cook in their kitchens. You would have to go about nikor, which means dissecting the animal to take out the parts that are not kosher, and they knew which parts of the animal were kosher and which ones weren't. Today, that's known by people who work in these meat factories, right? But not by us. And then once that was done, then they could go ahead and make their nice chicken soup. This is the context for a case, and we're not holding Rabbi Yonas Leibshitz yet. Steve asked how many chickens were born without hearts. You're soon going to see this was apparently a common question that came up. This is the context for a case that occurred in 1709 in Hamburg. Elise, if you can read it for us, please. On page 68, text 9, the missing heart.
Okay. There was an incident involving a young girl who opened a slaughtered hen to remove its innards. She was standing at the edge of the table, and the cat was near her waiting to eat anything that was tossed to the ground. The girl claimed that she did not find a heart in the hen. The owner of the hen, her mother, suggested that the heart certainly dropped to the ground and was eaten by the cat, which was ready and waiting to eat anything that fell. The girl insisted, however, that she only threw the spleen to the ground and not the heart. The hen was fat, healthy, and good, with no defect or rot in its innards, and there was no visible trace of a heart that had decayed or dissolved. Furthermore, when the hen was alive, it appeared strong and healthy. Yet the girl claimed she could not find its heart. The case was brought before the students, and they ruled the chicken to be non-kosher.
Okay. I feel like I should give a little bit more background, which maybe I should have done before Elise read. One of the laws of shechita is that you have to inspect the animal to make sure that it's not treifa. Now, treifa, many of you recognize because the word treif, which today has become colloquialized, and we just use it to refer to anything that's not kosher. But the actual word treifa means, which literally translates as malt, what it means is a specific type of non-kosher. It means that you slaughter an animal, and inside that animal you find that this animal had some sort of a maim, some sort of a defect, that it would not have been able to live a year. I think that's the exact issue. In the Talmud and Cholim lists a whole list of different types of mumim, of maims that an animal can have, or injuries that an animal can have, which would render it treifa. The most common, or maybe the most not popular, the most well-known, is a hole in the lungs. And then there's a whole discussion which leads to a whole designation in kosher about galat kosher or not galat kosher, because there's a whole discussion about if the lungs have the lungs, by the way, is, I think that's what this picture is supposed to be. I think it's supposed to be lungs, not a heart. If the lungs have an imperfection on them, not a hole, but a rough patch. So the question is, would that eventually have become a hole or not? And there's all sorts of discussion about the commentary about whether that makes the animal treif or not. Now, the absence of a vital organ is a much simpler version, and lesser discussed for that matter, version of treifa. If you open up an animal, it doesn't have a spleen, it doesn't have a heart, obviously, that makes the animal clearly treif. In the case that you see here in Hamburg, the yeshiva students accepted the testimony of the young girl, that the hen had no heart, and they ruled that the chicken could not be eaten. Ultimately, this case attracted the attention of other European rabbis, including Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi, who was a local rabbi in Hamburg, who summarized the case for us as we see above. Another rabbi who wrote on this topic, though it was 50 years later, was Rabbi Yonas Leibshitz. Now, why are they discussing this case so much? Because apparently there were multiple instances of people coming to rabbis asking about a chicken without a heart. Most likely today, with the scientific evidence that we have today, in every single situation, something happened to the heart, and therefore the hen did not have a heart, or the chicken did not have a heart. But Rabbi Yonas Leibshitz wants to put this whole thing to bed once and for all. So he writes to the professors, right, at the University of Halle, and essentially what he's doing is he's doing a rigorous investigation to determine the reality on the ground before he issues a halachic ruling. So what does he ask? He asks two questions, and they document this, by the way. We'll soon see in a nice postscript that they have this in their libraries. The first question he asks them is, you can follow along with me if you'd like on page 69, is it possible for a living creature to survive without a heart? Why is he asking this question? Because if the answer is yes, Rabbi Eishitz will assume that what occurred in the case was there wasn't a heart. This chicken never had a heart, and that's fine. That could be a birth defect that a chicken has, and meaning based on their science that they would say that a chicken could live without a heart. Then he'll assume the chicken had no heart, and if it had no heart, then this animal is treif, and therefore you can't eat it, right? So if they would tell him that you cannot survive without a heart, that means there was a heart, just that the the cat ate the chicken's heart. Sounds like Chad Gadya, doesn't it? The cat ate the chicken's heart, and therefore the ruling is that it would be kosher. His second question is, can another organ take over the function of the heart, thus allowing the heartless hen to survive? If that's the case, then he would assume the cat did not eat the heart, but rather what happened was the chicken did not have a heart. Some other organ took over the role of the heart and therefore allowed the chicken to survive. And in this case, the animal will be treif. But it's all going to be dependent on their answer, on what the scientific reality, or the best knowledge that these scientific experts have. So in their reply, the professors reiterate that living creatures require a heart, but they also added that some analogous structure can serve the same function. Today, I think that's been proven not to be the case, that an animal cannot survive that heart, etc. And this is what leads him to classify the chicken as treifa, because lacking a heart, even with an artificial substitute, constitutes a mortal injury and would therefore make this animal not kosher. As a fun PS, it's interesting to note that it was discovered a few years ago by Rabbi Dr. Edward Reichman that the University of Halle holds a faint echo of this question from Rabbi Eibschitz. They have a ledger. You can see this in the PowerPoint on the screen. In the school, they have a ledger from prior centuries documenting various questions that were submitted to the professors and the discussions surrounding them. And one entry reads, you can see it highlighted, January 8th, 1763, a responsum to 2 questions from the Jewish community has been issued concerning the circumstances of Jewish kosher slaughter, which is fascinating. It's most likely the same case. All right, we're running a little low on time, so let's pick up the pace here. Scenario number 3, scene number 3. Why was Rabbi Naftali Chaim Horowitz traveling across the Middle East in search of Cypriot chicken? The answer is that, of course, he too was doing his due diligence, and the question he was trying to answer was, are these chickens kosher? What is the issue? Let me explain. The technological advances of the 19th century, such as trains and steamships, revolutionized trade and transportation, allowing products to move across the world and across regions in unprecedented ways. This included the introduction of new breeds of chickens to Europe, including the Cypriot chicken, which originated in Cyprus, in Greece, and it was a bit larger than the typical European chicken, and it sounded a bit different too, but it mostly looked like a chicken. Why is this such an issue? It's an issue because the Torah does not give us any signs for kosher or non-kosher chicken. For kosher and non-kosher animals, we have very clear, split hooves, chewing their cud, beautiful. For kosher and non-kosher fish, we have 2 signs, beautiful, fins and scales. But for chickens, we actually get a list of 24 non-kosher species, and every other species is kosher.
Right. Yeah.
Sounds pretty simple, right? The problem is, these species are listed in, you guessed it, Hebrew. Not just Hebrew, but biblical Hebrew. And while some of those words today are a reference in modern Ivrit to certain birds, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily what the Torah is referring to. So the Talmud clarifies exactly what these it tries its best to clarify for you what are the characteristics of these, to describe these 24 birds. But those signs and those descriptions that are in the Talmud, that's not what makes the animal kosher or not kosher. Those are just descriptive factors. Till today, we are enjoined by our sages to only eat chickens if there is a clear Masorah, if there is a clear, reliable tradition that these are one of the species that are not part of those 24 unkosher species. Let's look at text 10. Elise, if you can read it for us, please. This is from Rabbi Moshe Isserlich in the Shulchan Aruch, or the Ramah, as he's known. Text 10, tradition. Go for it. Elise?
All right. One should not eat any bird unless there is a received tradition that is kosher. This is the established practice, and one should not deviate from it.
All right. So come as it arises that these new breeds of species of chicken arrive, and they look different, they sound different, nobody's sure anymore. Is this part of the Masorah or is it not part of the Masorah? We have to go to the place where these Cypriot chicken originate from to find out if the Jews that are living there eat these chickens or not, because they're the ones without the Masorah. Otherwise, there's a huge gap in the Masorah. We would be trying to figure it out based on the Talmud, which obviously would be impossible because we don't know if these are the same chickens that they're talking about. So this is what leads them on this wild chicken chase to try and figure this out. All right, beautiful. So, okay. So far, through several examples, we've seen how essential it is for a rabbi to investigate and fully understand the facts on the ground before issuing a halachic ruling. As we saw, this often means closing the sacred books, not keeping your nose inside the Talmud, right? But actually going out into the real world, maybe even going on a wild chicken chase, maybe taking having an electrical engineering background, maybe establishing an institute of rabbis and scientists that work side by side, which is what we have today in Israel, right? Which we saw about in the video with Rabbi Berobel, right? But sometimes we actually do have the answer in the books. And sometimes the answers in those books actually contradict the science. Mm-hmm. And this is fascinating. Why? Because in those instances, what we are told to do is to hold fast to what is written in the text and not to believe the current science. Again, only if the text says something very, very clearly. And a striking example of this is the fascinating 18th century debate over the declaration of death. Please turn your attention to the video screens. This is fascinating stuff.
Death is certain, since it is inevitable, but also uncertain, since its diagnosis is sometimes fallible. So warned Jacob B. Winslow, the Danish-born anatomist who lit the spark of one of the strangest fears, the terror of being buried alive. In 1740, Winslow published a Latin thesis arguing that no breath, no pulse, and no sign of life weren't enough. Vast numbers of persons that have been too soon interred, he wrote, probably call aloud from their graves for a due vengeance on those who have barbarously exposed them to a violent death. He insisted only visible decay could confirm death. Anything else was guesswork. Jacques-Jean Bruyère translated Winslow's thesis into French, sensationalized it, and added pages of blood-curdling tales. One of his most infamous? Madame Rousseau. Declared dead, she was sliced with leeches just to make sure. She revived, lived, and gave birth to 26 children, one for each cut. Bruyère's book stirred mass hysteria. Wills composed in Paris reflect the panic. Early in the 18th century, almost none mentioned premature burial precautions. But between 1760 and 1777, nearly 50 out of 1,000 did. German cities responded with institutions where corpses were laid out to rot before burial. The most famous? The Munich Leichenhaus, or Corpse House, where fingers and toes were tied to bells and harmoniums. If a body moved, the music would sound and a sentry would rush in. The harmoniums rang often, not because the dead came back to life, but because swelling from decay triggered the mechanism. Over many decades, not a single revival was documented in any German Leichenhaus. Another response to the fear was the security coffin. In 1792, Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick commissioned one with windows, air holes, and a lock and key. Later models featured ladders, lights, even telephones to call for help from beneath the ground. Over 30 versions were patented in Germany in the latter half of the 19th century. The panic led some governments to mandate waiting periods before burial. In 1772, the Duke of Mecklenburg passed a law requiring that no one be buried until 3 days after death. For Jews, this created a crisis, as Torah law demands immediate burial. When they objected, the Duke insisted on receiving rabbinic letters declaring the delay to be forbidden by the Torah, which the community did eventually procure. Looking back, we know the widespread fear of premature burial was unfounded. While there have been isolated cases throughout history of people being buried alive, it was never a pervasive problem. But in that moment, it was a story of deep tension between a people commanded to honor the dead by burying swiftly and a world terrified of burying too soon.
So how was this discussed in Jewish law? So now it's time to go to the local rabbi of the time, right? So this is the 1700s, and a leading rabbinic figure of the time is Rabbi Yaakov Emden, all right? And Rabbi Yaakov Emden responded to one of the Jews who advocated for this accommodation, for these, I don't know, bells or whistles, I don't know, their phones, I don't know what they were putting inside it. And Rabbi Emden pointed to a law which was stated in the Talmud and summarized in the Shulchan Aruch. Essentially, they're asking, can we wait 3 days to bury the dead and then bury them with other things inside, in order to allow this accommodation that if somebody wakes up, they should be able. It's ludicrous to think about now, as we'll soon see why, because this was completely disproven. But we have to be able to go to the 1700s and be in the 1700s present as they were at the time, right? So they believe in this. Let's see. So he starts off by quoting a law from the Talmud and summarized the Shulchan Aruch, which is text 11a. Tova Jane, can you read it for us, please? It's on page 72.
Okay. If someone is trapped under collapsed debris on Shabbat, and there is uncertainty whether they are alive or dead, or even whether they are there or not, we clear the debris to check, despite the multiple layers of uncertainty. Okay, yeah. Even if they are found severely crushed and can only survive for a short time, we continue clearing until reaching their nose. If no sign of life is detected at the nose, they are confirmed as deceased. If the upper victims are found dead, one should not say the lower ones are certainly dead as well. I'm thinking of collapsed buildings and earthquakes and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly what's being discussed. Exactly.
Yeah. Rather, the
war
debris
zone
should be cleared because they may be alive. Because sometimes we're always having these rescues and they always find, God bless us, one person.
Absolutely. You remember in Surfside, there were all sorts of stories when that building collapsed in Surfside, Florida, or in 9/11,
Right.
in war zones. All the time these things happen. Okay. So this text is teaching us two things simultaneously, and that's what Rabbi Yaakov Emden is pointing out. So the Shulchan Aruch is written in the 1500s, sorry. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden is living in the 1700s, and he's quoting the Shulchan Aruch, but the Shulchan Aruch is really basing this on the Talmud, which is essentially telling us two things. Normally, this text is quoted as the origin for how far we go to try and save a life. Because as you know, Shabbat desecration from a Jewish perspective is a very, very big deal. We don't desecrate Shabbat for no reason. But to save a life, of course we desecrate Shabbat. So the question being discussed here is, what's if it's not to save a life, it's to potentially save a life? When do we decide there's no life to be saved? What if the whole top of the debris and the first 3 layers that we go through, a whole building collapsed? Unfortunately, Hashem Yirachim, Hashem should protect us from such things. But a whole building collapsed, there's a whole bunch of people on top that are dead. Do you keep digging on Shabbos, which is completely not allowed, saying potentially there might be people underneath that might be alive? Right? And the answer is you do. You keep going, just even for a potential life, you try and save the life. Because that's the first thing that this text is teaching us. But the second thing this text is teaching us is when we deem somebody dead. What is that? The nostrils. You take a look at the nostrils. In other words, often we discuss a pulse, brain dead, a heart, but from a halachic perspective, this is the origin for the fact that just breath, if somebody is no longer breathing, that is the barometer. Let's see how Rabbi Yaakov talks about this in text 11b. Elise, if we can jump back to you. Thank you so much to Tova, Jane, and Elise for reading for everybody here. I'm sorry that you guys don't have your books. Marilyn, your book is ready for pickup anytime. Steve, I'm going to mail yours out like that. You'll have it. All right, Elise, text 11b.
Okay.
Rejecting anxious speculation.
Okay. The sages were extremely careful about saving lives. Indeed, it is well known that we do not follow the majority in such cases. They stated that even if the upper victims are found dead, we still clear the debris and desecrate Shabbat out of doubt. Nonetheless, they also said that we suffice with checking the nose. They based this ruling on the verse Genesis 7:22. Everything that had the breath of life in its nostrils, indicating that there's no sign of life detected in the nostrils, it is known that the individual has died, and there is no longer a concern for saving a life. From this you learn that there is no substance here to the words of those who are devoid of Torah knowledge. Let my son not follow their approach. One who has faith will not be concerned about uncertainties arising from unreliable assessments and baseless conjectures.
So this is fascinating. This is fascinating because what's going on here is the exact opposite of everything we've seen in this lesson, which is fascinating. we have seen basically the rabbis should, as often as possible, consult the science, see what the science says, and then based on that, they should make their decisions. But there's one huge exception to that. If the Torah tells us what to do, then we follow the Torah and we wait for science to catch up. And in this case, the Torah provides precise criteria for determining death, which is the absence of responsiveness and breathing. And this was what Rabbi Yaakov Emden said in the 1700s. And of course, today we can look back, and here's a paper from 2001. Tova Jane, if you can read it for us, please, on page 75, text 12, false alarm, where we see, of course, that science was completely debunked, actually by their own data. Go ahead.
How many people's lives were actually saved by the German
Leichenhauser? That's those corpse houses that we saw in the video. Remember those?
Okay. A German writer claimed that by 1847, no apparently dead person had been discovered at any German Leichenhaus, and no one brought up evidence to the contrary. The Frenchman Julien-Antoine Josette, who was actually trying to build a case for the continuation of waiting mortuaries in France in 1845, visited the mortuaries of Frankfurt, Schausenhausen, Mainz, and Munich. He would conclude only that in the preceding 23 years, these institutions had supervised more than 46,500 corpses without a single detection of apparent death, nor could another French anti-premature burial campaigner active in the 1860s find any evidence of peoples having revived in the German Leichenhauser. It is clear that the ultimate decision in the 1890s to remove the alarm systems from many waiting mortuaries rested on the reality that for many years, not a single case of apparent death had been detected in any German Leichenhausen.
So in this case, you have a rabbinic refusal to embrace the popular trend of fearing premature burial and therefore waiting a few days, right? Which obviously is against Torah law to delay burial. And he wasn't ignoring reality. What he was being more firmly grounded in it. Because the Torah had very clear guidance about this, he was following Torah law, and then eventually the science caught up, which I think is a fascinating perspective. In conclusion, I think the lesson that we have from today's discussion is very, very clear. What we're talking about is there's this gap between Torah knowledge and worldly knowledge that a rabbi is called upon to fill. Yes, it's true that the Torah is rooted in heaven, but it also has to be grounded on earth. It is important for us to understand that while we turn to the Torah for guidance, that doesn't mean we ignore the reality of the world around us. And a rabbi is called upon to, as much as possible, accommodate the worldly reality and incorporate, and not just accommodate it, but to do his research, do his due diligence, to understand how the Torah can be applied to that situation. And I want to call your attention to the fact that this has continued up until today. As recently as the 1980s and 1990s, rabbis continue to discuss the discussion about when a person is considered dead, for example. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who is one of the most recent leading rabbinic authorities and has his own set of shut that I have right here, this one, Igrot Moshe, he spent over 2 years visiting hospitals, speaking with doctors to understand what exactly brain dead is, and when halacha should consider somebody dead, and whether this halacha that we have should be applied differently based on the realities that we have today in the world. And I'm not saying he came up with a firm decision, and we discussed a lot about this, by the way, for those that are interested. You know what, I'll link this lesson. We gave a course about 2 years ago called Decisions of Fate, which discussed different medical conundrums and the halachic approaches to them. And one of them was this topic, and I'll link to it in the after lesson email like that. You can see it. I can't remember which lesson it was, but I'll look it up and I'll find it and I'll link it. And we discussed it, and Moshe Feinstein and others that argued with him about when exactly a Jew is considered dead, that's when we go in and bury them and when we don't. Obviously this ties into pulling the plug and into DNR instructions, etc., etc. But my point is that these conversations continue till today, and they continue, by the way, this is 1980s, 1990s. The whole lesson 6 that we're going to discuss in this lesson is all about futuristic technologies, things like AI and space travel and lab-grown meat and all different modern conversations in which the Torah is not going to change, but rabbis need to either become familiar or consult those that are familiar with the facts on the ground before they make their decision. And I think this reminds us that our physical and spiritual lives are not supposed to be in conflict with each other. Torah and science, our physical needs and our spiritual needs, these shouldn't be mutually exclusive realms. They shouldn't be two worlds that are constantly at war with each other. Rather, we're supposed to find a way to have the two of them work in tandem. The spiritual should inform the physical, should elevate the physical, to actually transform the physical to also be spiritual, and together to serve Hashem with this beautiful harmony of these two worlds. Please turn your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson.
Lesson 2. Torah in the Trenches. 1. The Talmud emphasizes that divine assistance plays a key role in guiding a rabbi to the correct halachic ruling. Thus, a rabbi's spiritual integrity alongside academic excellence is essential for providing halachic counsel. 2. A rabbi must thoroughly explore the details of a question, often venturing beyond the study hall to learn about niche or obscure topics. Applying halachic texts to real-world investigations reflects the Torah's mission of uniting the physical and the spiritual. 3. In the 16th century, Rabbi David ibn Zimra investigated the origins of the Nile's annual inundation to determine whether a canal that ran through Cairo was suitable for ritual immersion. He sought expert testimony and rejected popular local myths about the Nile's rise. 4. In the 18th century, to rule on its kosher status, Rabbi Yonatan Eibeshitz consulted professors on whether a hen without a heart could survive. 5. In the 19th century, Rabbi Naftali Chaim Horowitz traveled extensively to investigate a chicken breed that had recently been imported to Galicia, seeking a Jewish community that had a living tradition that the breed was kosher. 6. In the 20th century, the Lubavitcher Rebbe used his engineering expertise to address the halachic question about Israeli ocean liners operating on Shabbat. 7. In the 18th century, rabbis rejected widespread fears of premature burial. Since the Code of Jewish Law provides clear criteria for diagnosing death, they relied on Torah guidance over popular uncertainty. This approach was eventually vindicated as the myth of premature burial was debunked.
Thank you all for joining us for Lesson 2. This has been Torah in the Trenches, and I look forward to seeing you all next week for Lesson 3, Precedent in Practice, How Past Rulings Are Applied to New Realities. Thank you all for joining us.
Is Steve waving goodbye or has he questions?
No, I have a few questions. I'll make them as quick.